There are a lot of cursed conlangs on this website, constructed languages that were meant to be confusing, illogical, unintuitive, and suboptimal for facilitating communication. And this week, I thought I'd throw my hat in the ring. Figuratively, yes, but also literally. But I've noticed that too many of these are the same. You make a distinction between ablative, allative, illative, elative, locative, and adessive, and then assign ndr to be represented by a capital H with circumflex, and that's great, but you could just do more. Make so many cases and genders that you'd never have to use the same word twice, add in consonant clusters so long you would need a break for breath, and make every adjective pronounced the same with a slightly different tone. You could keep adding more and more complexity, ad infinitum. So I decided to take the next logical step. Enjoy Shavorese, a language of infinite complexity. Alright, so what kind of alphabet did I cook up? Well, that's a lot of letters. What phonemes do they represent? And therein lies the problem. The way to condense infinity into a space the human mind can use it, you need to use spectra. My original idea was to cut out phonemes altogether, but I couldn't find a way to make it work with vocabulary, so I compromised. You could say I put the degree to which it was a spectrum on a spectrum. But you know how in most languages the pronunciation of phonemes is based on dialect? Well, in Shavorese, it's based on your individual idiolect. Let's get into the nitty gritty of phonology. Every sound that occurs in Shavorese appears in this graph. Let's start with a cube. This represents the letter P. Going back to front increases the voicedness of the plosive. I'll arbitrarily choose 3 cutoff points and assign symbols because we live in a world enslaved to the IPA, but remember in practice it's just a spectrum. Going right to left increases what I refer to as the oral release. At the low end of the oral release, we have the nasal release ma, which slowly becomes tenuous ba, fricated pa, and finally it becomes a full affricate pa. Now, going up to down changes the aspiration. At the top, we have fully aspirated pa, then tenuous ba, and then we run out of air to release in the middle. When we run out of air, we enter the non-pulmonics. First ejective ba, which goes out but doesn't use breath, and then all the way down to implosive ba. By determining which lines it falls between on every axis, we have up to 64 possible symbols, which is not a lot considering we have an uncountably infinite number of possible sounds. Some of these might seem difficult to pronounce, for example, ejectives don't actually have room for voicing, but we can resolve this by pre-voicing them to ba. Now within that cube we have another smaller cube bouncing around and spinning. Label each side of that cube and give it a good spin. You've just selected your realizations of the plosives. For that place of articulation, for the remaining 4 you need to respin. You could use the points of an octahedron instead of the faces of a cube though. These were my rules for P. Now onto the fricatives. The fricatives are connected to the extreme axis of oral release, but for them the oral release is the same as aspiration. So a fricative only has 2 coordinates, ranging from ejective all the way up to the approximates. Now, you may see these two connected and think, what's stopping the plosive box from bouncing over into the fricative area? And the answer is. Well, for one thing, the fricative box, although it isn't technically a box, is a triangular bipyramid with 5 points. If the two polyhedra come too close to each other, people would confuse the two, so it bounces off. This is what causes chain shifting, although they can't chain shift because there's nowhere for the fricative box to go. The swapping of the two boxes does occur, though, particularly in the southern dialect, where C is swapped with J, and in the eastern dialect, where Q is swapped with H. Now, if you turn the oral release aspiration up too high, you end up with an approximate, which is at the top of the two-dimensional vowel chart, the bottom of which is the open vowels. Vowels, which are vowels, don't have a value for voicing or aspiration. Instead, the other axis is nasalization, which, well, if we go back to plosive, you'll notice that if you turn oral release to a minimum, you get a nasal release, which becomes a nasal, which is on the extreme left of the vowel chart. The vowels are already spectra in normal languages, and here they're determined by the points of a pentagon. Now, vowels are also subject to fronting, homologous to a consonant's place of articulation. This is the third dimension for the vowel chart and the fourth for the consonant chart. Both the uvular and velar consonants merge into the single back vowel. Now is probably a good time to mention that velar and uvular consonants are strongly labialized. The palatals are, of course, the front vowels. The alveolars represent the rhoticized vowels, and labials aren't actually able to be represented by the IPA. They can be described as syllabic bilabial approximates, but they fall towards the center of the chart on frequencies. Believe it or not, we're still not done describing the shape of the phonology space. There's one last thing, which is that the fronting of a vowel stops mattering the more open it becomes. So all of the different places of articulation curve downwards to meet at ah. This obviously has the effect that only one of the vowel pentagons can dip into the open vowels at a time, while the rest are either close or heavily nasalized. The polyhedra representing the consonants can move through the fourth dimension, changing their place of articulation, but they rarely do for multiple reasons. Firstly, because they bounce off of the other cubes, they themselves are only three-dimensional and not hypercubes, and lastly because the bilabial falls between the front and back vowels, while in the consonant chart the palatals and alveolars are in the middle. Despite this, in the southern dialect the velar and uvular sounds are swapped, and in the eastern dialect the alveolar sounds and rhotic vowels are replaced entirely with lateral alveolar sounds. Am I making sense so far? Good, because that's all of the phonology. Well, that's actually not even close to all of the phonology, but I'll get into the rest of it when it comes up. A brief intermission for the phonotactics. Maximum syllable density is CCVC, with the first two always being a fricative and a plosive. However, a consonant cluster can't contain all three consonants. If the writing indicates that it should, a schwa is inserted to break it up. This also occurs across words. Similarly, if two open vowels occur next to each other, a glide is inserted to separate them. And if an open vowel occurs before a closed vowel, then they're compressed into a diphthong. This also occurs across words. Now, the cutoff point for open/closed vowels is arbitrary, and it is, of course, different for every speaker of the language. Now, onto morphology, which probably includes grammar the way I define it. Shavorese doesn't have parts of speech, a feature which is not unique to it, but it's kind of a cherry on top, except in this case, it's a cherry in the middle. The sentence structure is a loose SOV to the extent that words can even fill the roles of subject, object, and verb. To make things easier to understand, we can add declensions and conjugations. Now, if it is so important that a word be connected to another word, it can be inflected with respect to that word. To do that, you need to determine its case and gender. Quick explanation of those two concepts for those who don't know, because neither of them occur in English. The gender of a word is intrinsic, a characteristic of what it is. For the most part, they're assigned arbitrarily across languages. In most languages, the classes themselves don't even line up with traditional gender roles, so we instead refer to it as noun class. Noun gender is specific to a word, not an instant. Case, on the other hand, refers to a characteristic of what it does. Most languages have cases for subject, object, and many other kinds of indirect object. Case is specific to an instance, not a word. Case and gender can both be plotted on separate 2D graphs. The case of an object depends on the agency, or how much effect it actually has on the sentence versus being the one affected by it, and on the relevance, which is how important the information it provides is. Gender can be plotted based on animacy, with godlike at the top end and empty space at the bottom, and masculinity. You'd think male and female would be at the top and bottom of that, but what's more masculine than a man? A bear. And what's more feminine than a woman? A bird. Okay, that last one doesn't make much sense to you, but you don't live in the kingdom of Shavor. But a bear and crow are both animals, so I guess this one loops around. Now, by mapping the agency axis onto the aspiration, the relevance axis onto voicedness, the animacy aspect onto place of articulation, and masculinity axis onto oral release, you can pinpoint the exact four-dimensional location of a sound, unconnected to the polyhedra. These four-dimensional coordinates are called free phonemes, and the ones stuck to the points of a shape are called fixed phonemes. Now, we use the calculated free phoneme to conjugate. First off, we need to decline the word. Declensions are more or less when you inflect a word with respect to itself. We tack on the phoneme we generated to the end of the word, and then the endings for any word that it's important to indicate it's related to. If there are no such words, you don't need to decline it, unless it's important to indicate meaning. There are, of course, no rules for determining when it's important to do anything, but I'll choose now to give you the context to help you determine it on a case-by-case basis. In my first video about elementomology, I talked a little bit about co-lexification, where in some languages the word for to bleed can also mean blood, and the word for blood can also mean red, and the word for red can also mean fire, which can also mean tree, which can also mean bone, which can also mean blood. You get the point. In Shavorese, this web connects every single concept in the entire language. The words themselves can be thought of as blobs you drop on the web, which could mean anything they land on. The exact meaning of an instance can be whittled down, though, sometimes by including a declension, but more often it's by using tones! Tonogenesis in Shavorese is relatively recent, and the specific tone of a word can be described by where it falls on the tone arc. Just like in English, rising tones indicate uncertainty, and falling tones indicate finality, when they're used on a content word. Back to morphology, Shavorese of course has temporality. Time is already on a spectrum, but we here in English only make a distinction between the past, present, and future. Luganda and some other languages make a distinction between distant and near, but Shavorese, as usual, allows for a full spectrum of time. This can be indicated by the syllable excuse me, Ghdzhong being appended to the front of it, and that syllable being given a tone corresponding to exactly when in the timeline it occurred. Infinitive, which is when you're talking about the verb itself, not a specific instance of it, can be considered to be in the distant past, but compressed so much it's basically a single low tone. Subjunctive, which is when you're talking about a verb that might happen, can be considered to be in the distant future, but compressed so much it's basically a single low tone. Oopsie daisy, I accidentally made it a loop again. Obviously, since verbs aren't distinct from other parts of speech, any word can have temporality if the time it exists in is important to it. Almost done with morphology. Each sentence has to end with a particle. The quality and tone of that particle can be indicated as follows. The first three dimensions correspond to mood. Aspiration is equivalent to intensity, how strong the emotion is, voicedness to certainty, whether it's a statement versus a question, and the emotion wheel corresponds to oral release. Now, the place of articulation corresponds to the evidentiality. Evidentiality is something we don't have in English, and it more or less describes how much validity the sentence has, if it's a statement. Further up in the mouth means you heard about it from a source you don't really trust, middle of the mouth means you do trust your source, and back of the mouth means you witnessed it firsthand. The tone corresponds to formality. Not Latin formality in the sense that your friends are informal and everyone else is formal. Shavorese formality is based on importance. And finally, the vocabulary, and now I'll choose to drop the final element of phonology. This language is also signed. Now, it's not impossible to imagine using both sign language and verbal languages simultaneously. In fact, this is basically already what's happening to Italian. This is actually crucial because the oral vocabulary and the manual vocabulary don't line up one to one. You can make much more specific meanings depending on which of the two words you use for the hand and the mouth. You can additionally make it even more specific by controlling the degree to which your mouth versus hands do the majority of the talking. If the meaning is something more idealistic, you might just talk with your mouth while gesturing. And believe it or not, that's it. Now you can communicate in Shavorese. So let's try translating the sentence, I had already drunk all of the water. We start with the subject, I. The word used for I, me, myself, us, we, our, my, mine, consciousness, and brain are all ke, and this hand motion can represent I, me, myself, singular you, singular they, he, him, she, or her. That's a lot of definitions, but I will specify by declining the word. I personally am not super masculine, but I'm definitely a man, so I will give myself a golden ratio out of 8. I am most certainly alive, but I'm not a god, so I'll just say 3/4 for that. In this sentence, I am very relevant because I am the subject, and my agency is very high because I drank all of the water. So let's say 85% for relevance and 100% for agency. Plugging that all into the graph, we get approximately the breathy voiced alveolar approximate written out like this and pronounced like Now, the object of the sentence is all of the water. Water, I really wanted to translate into H2O, but the alphabet doesn't include O, so H2U it is. That means water, particularly it being alive or living water. The sign for that is this, particularly flowing or liquid water. I don't feel like I need to decline that to specify it, so I'll just give it a downtone, to give it a less grand drinking water meaning. I can write that as this. Now, it's kind of important that the water's gone, not that it is, but that it was. So I will append the beginning syllable and give it the tone, ah. But it's not just water, it's all the water. Now, it isn't all the water in the entire universe, it's just all the water that I had. So, this sign, which means all infinity, universal, worldwide, or expand, is probably just going to be relegated to a simple gesture. All the words Shterkuwog, which means almost, majority, or unanimous, does most of the heavy lifting. That needs to be inflected with respect to the water, which means it first needs to be declined. The concept of maximum is pretty close to the extremes in terms of gender, so I will give it a negative 0.45. For animacy, it's low, let's do 0.2. Relevance to the sentence is medium high because it's pretty important. I mean, there's no water left. Let's say 0.6. And the agency is very low because it is inanimate, so 0.1. That would give us something like appended onto the end like this, with an inserted glide was separating the two. And then we need to add the declension for water. Now, it was Andrew Tate who said, women don't drink water. So I'll take that to mean I've never seen women and water in the same room together, so it's obviously pretty feminine. And I will assign it a negative 0.22. Water is not alive, but it flows and moves, so it's more alive than, like, metal, so I'll give it a 0.35. Naturally, in this sentence it has a very high importance because it's both the object and implied by the verb, so I'll give it a full 0.9 in relevance, but it has no agency. Not only is it the direct object, but it's already been drunk, so a 0 in agency. That would make it around the implosive. Next up, the verb, to drink. The sign for it is this, meaning to drink, eat, consume, or smell. And the word "sknegh," which means to drink, thirst, emptiness, or dry. Also put this one into the same time as the water with the syllable and the tone ah. And then we end the sentence with a particle. So the way the sentence is framed, I'm talking about the past, and then in the past is when I drank the water. In other words, I'm telling a story about something that happened, and in the story, I'm thinking about something that happened. So from where I'm currently sitting, I know how it turns out, so I'm not too invested in it. 0.1 for intensity, but it is pretty bad for me that I ran out of water, so I will say dismayed, which is about a 0.45 for emotion. And I am pretty certain that this is bad, so I will go with a 0.8 for certainty. And lastly, our evidentiality. Well, I not only witnessed it, but I caused it, so 1. Although because the back of the mouth is certainty, it's written as 0. That gives us ah. Finally, the tone should correspond to who I'm talking to. And I'm talking to you. Now, I don't know much about you personally, and there is anonymity, so I could just go neutral, but there is sort of a student-teacher dynamic, so I will give it a slightly informal tone, and that's it. So the Shavorese translation of I had already drunk all the water is Ghdzhongrong, Shterkuwog,